Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Leaders of the group of 7 nations are gathering today in the Canadian Rockies for a crucial summit amid sharp divisions with the United States. Hosted by Prime Minister Mark Carney in Kananaskis, the meeting faces tense undercurrents over trade disputes, Middle East escalations and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Israel's latest airstrikes on Iran, which killed scores just hours ago, have thrown foreign policy into the spotlight. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says the Iran-Israel conflict will be high on the summit's agenda, alongside efforts to prevent nuclear escalation. Prime Minister Mark Carney is pushing for stability, job creation and mineral supply chains, but with President Trump in attendance, diplomats are bracing for a potential confrontation. Many are recalling Trump's infamous exit from the 2018 summit and hoping to avoid a repeat. The summit runs through to Tuesday, with world leaders including Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky and India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi expected to join. For parts of the discussions, well, this summit at a moment of geopolitical instability across continents, of course in the spotlight, as we've mentioned, the current Israel-Iran tensions, but lots more to discuss. Joining us is Ross Feingold, political analyst, who's joining us from Taipei. Ross, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us on this special show where we're looking at this G7 summit. Let's start with that talking point, the big geopolitical incidents, the ongoing Israel-Iran tensions. What's the significance of this happening at a meeting where not just the leaders of the group of 7, but also other pivotal and important nations are going to be taking place? Hello, Ross. I believe, could you unmute? Is that possible?
Yeah. The significance, first and foremost, is that it's going to take up a lot of the time. It's going to take up a lot of the agenda. Originally, I'm sure the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza would have taken up some time on the agenda, but they have so many other issues they want to discuss, trade being one of them, countering China probably being another issue that several of the countries want to discuss, various other environmental issues that are important to some of the participants, although not important to President Trump. But now they're going to be devoting a lot of time to the Israel-Iran war. It's not what the G7 is really meant to be talking about. But unfortunately for the participants, they have no choice. They're going to be spending a lot of time talking about this depending on what happens in the coming hours.
Yes, absolutely. An escalation is possible. Benjamin Netanyahu talking about this lasting potentially weeks. Also Iran saying that they will continue to strike Israel in the manner that they have until those hostilities stop. Of course, for the region itself, this is completely destabilizing, but there are wider ramifications. G7 nations have already been involved in talk from Iran, the US, the UK and France, notably. How important is a united Western front in the face of an escalation that could spill over to not just a regional dispute, but a wider global dispute with the US keenly involved?
Realistically speaking, there's probably not going to be much of a united Western front, starting with the fact that the United States is such a close supporter of Israel. Although President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, they rushed to say that the United States was not involved with Israel's attack. But be that as it may, the United States is still a key supporter of Israel. It goes without saying. They're a weapons supplier to Israel. And if Iran continues its missile and drone attacks on Israel, it's possible that the United States military might get involved in the coming hours or days. The message that might come from other G7 or the guest participating countries is going to be very different than what a United States message is going to be. So I think the idea of a united front, while that might be good if it actually happens, I think that's going to be extraordinarily difficult. And also keep in mind that some of the G7 countries, as well as other participants in this meeting, like South Africa, have been very critical of Israel's conduct of the war against Hamas in Gaza. So it's not a moment when some of these countries have great sympathy for Israel.
Ross, you of course join us from Taipei. China is potentially a topic of discussion with rising tensions in the region, further military drills in the South China Sea. Japan have spoken about those as well. How significant is the issue of China, not just in geopolitics, but also with trade as well? Of course, trade tensions, a key topic we expect to be discussed as well.
China is a hugely important topic for the G7. They've been talking about de-risking from China for many years already, all the way back to the first Trump administration. The United States, in the first Trump administration, put a lot of pressure on G7 partners to decouple or de-risk from China. And it's taken some of those countries some time, but I think it's fair to say that most of the G7 participants do have the mindset of de-risking or decoupling from China, but then these countries have to work together to actually achieve that. On the other hand, with the potential of trade friction between the United States and some of the G7 countries, there is a recent effort by some of those European countries to open a new door with China, to recalibrate that relationship and to make it somewhat less antagonistic. And the reason why they're doing that is they want to trade with China. They want to make money. They want their companies to be able to invest and make money in China, and they have to be willing to let Chinese goods come into their country. So the reality is, over the last few months, we've seen some movement by Europe, possibly because of friction with the United States, that they seem more open to a trade relationship once again with China. So how to balance de-risking or decoupling with their desire to make money in China is something to watch at this G7 meeting. But there's definitely a trend with some of those European countries like Germany and France, and even recently the UK. They've shown a new willingness to do business with China recently.
Yes, and moving from Chinese trade, I want to move to Europe. Of course, Ursula von der Leyen is going to be present at this summit. The EU have been, as far as we're aware, locked in negotiations with the US administration, but also Ursula von der Leyen has been extremely vocal on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What do you think the EU agenda will be and the EU goals heading towards this summit?
They better have some very modest goals, because unlike previous G7 meetings under President Biden, when we saw very united and very strong support for Ukraine, and that was reflected in the conversations as well as the joint statements made at G7 meetings, that's not going to come from President Trump. Even though Ukraine President Zelensky is going to be there in person, we should not expect President Trump to sign on to anything that's even vaguely similar to previous G7 statements about support for Ukraine. So that's definitely something to watch. But I think President Trump is going to be very, very conservative and careful about making any commitments when it comes to weapons or support for Ukraine.
Yes, so let's build on that, Ross. Of course, Canada hosting this G7 summit. They are part of the several nations involved in the coalition of the willing. The UK and France deeply involved, with Ursula von der Leyen there as well. How key an issue will this be? And do you think we might see any resolutions over a clear messaging with the United States backing over this 30-day ceasefire, as talks of further direct talks between Russia and Ukraine are there, but an understanding of peace seems to be distant?
I think the European leaders, when they meet together without President Trump, they're going to have productive conversations, and they're going to remain united when it comes to supporting Ukraine, whether that's through cash or through weapons. And when it comes to calling on a ceasefire, that might be where they could have some common messaging with the United States. But again, when it comes to arming Ukraine, I think President Trump is going to be very hesitant to agree to any of that. So we're going to see some disunity from the G7 countries on that topic, even if we might see some unified messaging when it comes, broadly speaking, to calling on Ukraine and Russia to agree to a ceasefire.
Yes, we know that South Africa are going to be present. Ramaphosa, of course, was in the Oval Office with President Trump, going through an interesting experience, being played videos, talk of white genocide, interesting topics. What is South Africa's role in this discussion? What are their aims? What are their goals? And how will they contribute as a nation that, of course, is on the cusp of those G7?
Having recently met with President Trump, and as you said, the meeting was certainly interesting. Not much came out of it in a positive way for President Ramaphosa. So I think he's going to look at the opportunity to meet with the other leaders and expand his personal relationship with the European leaders and with Canada and the other non-G7 attendees. But frankly, I think he's going to try and stay far away from President Trump other than shaking his hand.
Yes. Let's look at President Trump. Of course, he is currently facing difficulty in the United States. Protests that aligned with his military parade marking his 79th birthday and also the 250th anniversary of the US Army. Trump often feels like and acts like and speaks like he holds the cards in all of these geopolitical situations. We saw a tweet from him earlier talking about the Iran-Israel, sorry, I clarify, Truth Social, not tweet, where he was talking about getting a deal done similar to the one that was made between Pakistan and India. Do you think he's going to use this summit to continue that message that he is in charge of these situations, he is the peacemaker, and putting himself front and centre of the concerning geopolitical situations that are ongoing?
The President of the United States, regardless of who it is always going to be front and center at these kind of international meetings, perhaps Trump even more so because of his personality, his speaking style, and his use of social media. It's true, as you said, that the Trump administration and Secretary of State Rubio specifically were instrumental in bringing a quick end to the Pakistan-India hostilities. But that's a very different situation compared to Israel and Iran, because the United States has a relationship with both India and Pakistan. Obviously, the United States doesn't have that kind of relationship with Iran, and frankly, Prime Minister Netanyahu won't be willing to end the hostilities as long as he thinks there's more to do or that he has the upper hand. If there's still facilities that Israel feels it has to take out, they're going to continue to do that. It's going to be very difficult to bring about an end to the hostilities this quickly. I would expect it to go on for at least a few more days, possibly while the G7 are still talking. And remember, President Trump's record, he got the peace or the armistice ceasefire between India and Pakistan, but he hasn't gotten one between Israel and Hamas or between Russia and Ukraine. So he has a mixed record on that front.
Yes, Ross, I'm glad that you brought Israel-Hamas into this conversation, because the recent Middle Eastern escalations and developments have sort of put that in the shadows. But there is still a reported humanitarian crisis going on the ground in Gaza. Before the flare-up between Israel and Iran, there was widespread Western condemnation of the ongoing situation in Israel. Do you think that will still be a point raised? Do you think there will still be conversations from leaders who have openly spoken out against Israel with the United States, who of course aligned with Israel and supporting Israel in all of their actions?
It will definitely come up in the conversation, but you could be assured that it's going to get less time than it would have without the flare-up of hostilities between Israel and Iran. So they'll talk about it, but they're not going to be able to talk about it as much as they want to, keeping in mind the European countries also want to talk at length about Ukraine and Russia, and they have all the other issues like trade, for example, that they need to talk about, or China, et cetera, et cetera. So that's unfortunate for the civilians in Gaza. Clearly, there's a need to bring in more aid. But there also would be a lot of pushback from President Trump. He's going to say that first, it's Hamas's fault. They're not agreeing to the ceasefire that the United States has proposed, which would allow much more aid to get in. And Hamas won't agree to that ceasefire because it's not a permanent end to the war. It's only a temporary ceasefire. And Hamas insists that the only agreement they want to sign is one that brings about an end to the war. Well, Israel and the United States are not going to agree to that kind of ceasefire. And then also the United States is going to say, we've arranged for this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to operate in Gaza. It's unfortunate that the United Nations and some of the other key stakeholder countries have an animosity towards this setup. But at the moment, it's the only available organization that is distributing food aid. And the United States attitude is going to be work with us, work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is on the ground and trying to distribute food. Stop trying to push for some other alternative model that neither the United States nor Israel are going to agree to.
Yes, Ross, we've detailed several areas in the world where hostilities are underway, where wars are being fought, where humanitarian crises are ongoing. But on a defence front, it's something that several discussions have been had. NATO Chief Mark Rutte talking about a need to up defence spending, the US also being clear that a certain level should be met in the face of uncertainty and potential adversity. How significant will that be in this summit? Do you think there will be discussions about defence spending in the face of wars across continents?
It might come up, but also keep in mind that later this month is the NATO summit in The Hague. So President Trump will be attending that. As of now, he's attending it in person. And that's really going to be the NATO discussion about increased defense spending. And I think President Trump is really going to give it to the other NATO leaders at that meeting. He's going to be very direct in telling them that they need to spend more on their defense. Will he bring it up at this meeting? It's possible. The United States views on, for example, Australia, not a NATO country, but recently Secretary of Defense Hegseth was very direct in telling Australia, to use one example, that they have to significantly increase their defense spending. And the Prime Minister of Australia, Prime Minister Albanese, basically said, we'll decide on our own what our defense spending should be. Thank you very much.
Yes, Ross, if you stay with us, we do have some breaking news to bring you, and a US-based human rights group says that Israeli strikes across Iran have killed over 400 people. The Washington-based human rights activists report that at least 406 people have died in these attacks, with another 654 injured. The figures, which cover the entirety of Iran, mark a sharp escalation in the conflict between the two nations. Iran's government has not released any official casualty numbers yet, but local sources and medics are reporting dozens dead in multiple provinces, including women and children. Well, we are now joined once again by Megha Sharma, the senior executive editor with us at NewsX World. Megha, I've just brought that breaking news of over 400 deaths being reported by a humanitarian group. Of course, this hasn't been confirmed. These have to be taken with a slight pinch of salt, given the fact that there is limited information on the ground from official sources. But given the number of deaths being reported, how significant is this ahead of the G7 summit, with so much of the meeting expected to be covered and spoken on this ongoing conflict with deadly consequences?
So Josh, I'm going to start off with, the security situation over here, which has been very tight, and rightly so, because the group of 7 heads of the states from the 7 countries, and not just the 7 countries, there's the European Union Commission, there's the European Council President, there are 5 other nations, including Mexico, South Korea, India, Ukraine. They're all going to be present over here. They're all going to be descending here now in just a few moments, and therefore to better understand how the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have been able to ensure that safety and security is ensured. Let's get in somebody who is the head of security over here. I have with me Charles Poirier. He is a sergeant. He is a part of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Thank you very much, Charles. And my first question to you about how long have you been, circulating and ensuring that there is tight security, particularly when the tourist season is on over here in Banff?
Absolutely, you've said it. It is the biggest domestic security event in Canada. So for 9 months, actually, we've been planning this event. And for the past few weeks, we've been starting to, implement a controlled access zone surrounding the lodge, the Promenade Kananaskis Lodge, where the actual G7 summit is going to take place. So it is a lot of officers. We're talking thousands of police officers, but also private security and other partners to make sure that, this area is the safest in Canada, actually.
Right. I was also reading one of the articles yesterday when I landed in. There were helicopters that have been deployed since June 5th. There is the Royal Mounted Air Force that has been in action. If you could tell us more about what does it all entail to ensure a successful, smooth event of a stature of G7?
Absolutely. So the ISSG, the Integrated Safety and Security Group, is led by the RCMP, but it comprises of Alberta Sheriffs, the Alberta Conservation Officers, the Calgary Police, and the Canadian Armed Forces. So we've got some helicopters, we've got some drones, we've got some vehicles, we've got some ATV patrols, all-terrain vehicles, in the woods, surrounding the area. Basically, the idea is to prevent anyone from entering the zone to ensure that the actual summit is not disturbed, and taking into account the possible protest and demonstration that may occur. So it is a big challenge to mobilize that many people. We've actually had a very great times with the community, with the locals here. We have a community outreach group that went out, explained to them what was going to happen, which road would be closed, which trails would be closed. And as you said, it's prime tourist season, right? So we recognize that it is an inconvenience for some tourists, and that's why we're going to make this as easy as possible for them.
Right. Also, you talk about restrictions. You talk about a number of hiking trails that at this point of time have been halted, keeping in mind these 3 days are going to be very crucial. How are you able to reach out to the tourists? Also, I'm staying at a resort, and of course there are signages and mentioning about these 3 days are going to be, important, and therefore restrictions in place. There may be traffic restrictions that will also come into effect. And you said there are thousands of these RCMP and other volunteers who are working together to make this a success. With regards to the security of the likes of President Trump, there's going to be, Emmanuel Macron, who's going to be the president of France. All these heads of states are very important. So how does the RCMP ensure that their security is paramount and the area is secured? I understand the media is also not allowed to go up to Kananaskis.
That's right. So the easiest thing for us is because we have that expertise. It's not our first major event, right? So the RCMP has a unique expertise when it comes to managing major events, and we found that by using this integrated model with partners, we're able to better coordinate the resources to ensure that if something were to happen, let's say on a highway or at the airport, we're notified immediately because we're embedded, right? We know exactly what's going on in real time. This is a 24/7 operation, and it has been for a few days. So we're monitoring social media, we're monitoring the news, we're monitoring everything. And also we have community outreach officers that have actually gone and talked with the community leaders, the businesses, the residents, to ensure that if they see something that they can report it right away so that we know, how to respond.
Well, you're doing a commendable job, so congratulations, and thank you for keeping us all safe and secure. And G7 Summit looks like going to be a big success.
I think it will be a big success. We're definitely ready for anything that might come our way, and hopefully, everything runs smoothly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Charles. So that was Charles Poirier, the sergeant at the RCMP. Back to you, Josh.
Thank you very much, Megha Sharma, for that insight and updates. Let's move now. Ross, are you still with us? Well,
Yes, I am.
Yes, Ross is still here. Ross, I do want to get a reaction to that breaking news that we had just before we spoke to Megha about the security at the G7 summit. Of course, a key topic at the summit will be the ongoing tensions between Iran and Israel. Reports from a humanitarian group that over 400 people have now died. Given the significance of that loss of life, what impact will that have on these discussions that take place? Does this change the game if hundreds of people are dying, hundreds of civilians are dying?
It really depends on what the Iranian government does in response. Are they going to attack Israel? Are they going to attack military targets in Israel? Are they going to attack civilian targets in Israel? If they attack civilian targets in Israel, then there's going to be a swift Israeli response, and the death toll is going to increase on both sides. So this is very much in the hands of the Iranian government at the moment, assuming that this figure is correct, because it is much higher than previous media reports.
Yes, absolutely. The Iranian media reporting earlier today that around 120 people had died, up from 75. So this would be a significant increase. I also want to look at the areas that have been struck. We know that Israel's huge military action and attacks have mainly focused on military and nuclear targets, these being key of course, in discussions that the US and Iran have had over a potential nuclear deal. Will there be discussion about striking nuclear bases and nuclear facilities? We heard the IAEA chief Grossi talk about this. It's something that should be raised. Do you think it will be, given the potential safety ramifications and security ramifications of nuclear plants being struck?
Well, for starters, there's no talks between Iran and the United States at the moment. The negotiating session that was supposed to occur in Oman today, the United States was willing to attend still, but Iran canceled in the aftermath of the Israeli military action. But going forward, again, it's up to the Iranian government how they want to play this. They might very well take a new stance in the negotiations and say, we need to rebuild from scratch our civilian nuclear research. It depends what kind of public position they want to take. On the one hand, they might say that, and for public relation purposes, they might say that Israel's attack had no effect on their nuclear uranium enrichment programs or their research and development. On the other hand, they might say we need to start from scratch, and any deal that we sign with the United States and the other stakeholders has to allow us to reconstitute the civilian nuclear program, well, what they claim is a civilian nuclear program. So it really remains to be seen. It's just too early to tell what the Iranian negotiating position is going to be if and when they return to negotiations with the United States.
Yes, negotiations with the United States, something we expect to happen on the sidelines. Two nations that have been deep in discussions related to those trade tensions and Liberation Day tariffs. Japan and the United States. Shigeru Ishiba expected to hold discussions with President Donald Trump. We understand that several have taken place. Do you think that a deal like that could be agreed at this summit, or could it at least be a next step along the line of those being agreed? Because let's not forget that Trump's original deadline, the 8th of July, is coming up.
That's right. The 8th of July deadline's coming up, and most likely there's going to have to be an extension for some of the trading partners that have already engaged with the United States. When it comes to Japan, they're one of the closest allies of the United States. The Prime Minister has been to Washington to meet with President Trump. His negotiating teams have met with the United States negotiating teams. I think if there's any country that's going to be at the top of the list to sign an agreement, it's going to be Japan. But when will that be? We simply don't know, other than we could assume it's probably going to be one of the first few countries. But does that mean it's going to happen this week? Not necessarily. It could still be later in June. It might even come after the deadline, which means a lot of other countries are going to have to wait even longer. But I do think the United States negotiators are eager for a deal with Japan as well, and they're going to put a lot of resources, which basically means the time and the personnel to reach an agreement with Japan. But if a lot of time and personnel are going into one country, that means that those personnel don't have the time to deal with other countries simultaneously.
Yes, Ross, of course, Trump's trade policy is expected to be discussed at length on the sidelines. We also know that Trump's key policy during his election, and that he has enacted since taking office for the second time, has been surrounding immigration. And one key country that has been invited to these talks is Mexico. Disputes have been ongoing over immigration policy, something which of course has blown up in Los Angeles after a series of arrests with protests turning violent. How do you think talks between the US and Mexico will go on immigration if they do indeed take place as bilaterals on the sidelines?
That's really risky for President Sheinbaum. I think if I was advising her, I would recommend that she exchange pleasantries with President Trump and not try to engage him in a technical conversation about immigration or fentanyl. She's had phone calls with him. She's had good outcomes from the phone calls, but it should probably be left to negotiating teams, whether that's on the security side or the trade side. I think with the busy agenda that's going to happen, we don't know what kind of focus President Trump is going to be, what issue he's really going to want to talk about. But if she starts to engage him in a technical or a detailed discussion, he might say you're doing nothing about immigration or fentanyl, and Mexico's going to be back at square one. So my best advice to her would be to exchange pleasantries but avoid a detailed discussion.
Yes, Ross, Mexican and US relations of course, in the spotlight, but Mexican, US and Canadian relations as well, something which has broken down at points, clear agenda at the start of Trump's tariff action, targeting those two border nations. With Canada hosting this meeting, does that put them on a stronger footing if there are discussions between those three nations of North America?
Probably not. I mean, these negotiations could happen at any time. The fact that they're in Canada, I don't think that changes the views of President Trump. We'll see if he repeats the statement he often makes about Canada being better off as the 51st state of the United States. Maybe he won't say that because he's physically in Canada and he prefers to say that from the safety of his Truth social media platform. We really don't know. But again, with a very busy agenda, we have this urgent international issue of Israel and Iran in a war. It's probably not the time for Prime Minister Carney or President of Mexico Sheinbaum to try and pigeonhole Trump into having a detailed discussion about trilateral relations.
Yes, absolutely. Mark Carney, I do want to come back to him, of course, because his position as a political leader is new, but also his life in politics is new. Is there any background context to this, given the fact that he is hosting these world leaders as a general novice in this world?
Really, the only background here is that he visited Washington, he visited President Trump in the Oval Office. That meeting seemed to go well. They seemed to hit it off personally, which is very important for President Trump. But they still have a lot of unresolved issues between the two countries. And are they going to reach any grand agreements on the sidelines of the G7? It's always possible, but again, I think Carney is going to be very busy hosting all the representatives of the various countries, and they have so many issues to discuss. And with this urgent issue of the Israel-Iran war, it's probably not the time to try and get Trump to agree to anything bilaterally.
Okay, looking at Mark Carney and Canada, their role, of course, geopolitically is one that is involved in so much. We know that a conversation between Mark Carney and Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, is underway. We don't know if that is still ongoing. We showed live visuals of the two leaders embracing and then heading inside for those talks. The United Kingdom and Canada, while not huge powerhouses, are linked. They're linked in the coalition of the willing. They're linked, of course, with a rich history that goes back all the way to the world wars and further. What do you think that those two will be talking about? What will the key topics be in that discussion that is taking place ahead of this meeting?
Key topic will be trade, international security issues like Ukraine or the war in Gaza or the war between Israel and Iran might take up some of the time as well. But I think trade in Ukraine will probably take up a lot of the time between the two countries.
Yes, we are now joined by Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, who is a former Indian diplomat who is joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for once again joining us, Ambassador Kapoor. You are obviously positioned as a former diplomat to have more knowledge on this than many others. Can you provide some context on how these conversations might be had on the sidelines? Is it as simple as two people sitting in a room and discussing a topic that they want to, or is there more planning that needs to go into this?
Well, Joshua, thank you for the question. These things are generally not that simple. There's a lot of prep which gets done for many weeks in advance. And of course, there are certain leaders who bring about radical changes into the whole algorithm or into the old paradigms, like President Donald Trump. But in more normal forms of diplomacy around the world, there is a lot of exchanges of information, exchanges of messages, meetings at various levels, discussions between the ambassadors who are there in those countries and the foreign offices. And finally you come to some sort of a blueprint for the discussions. Of course, the discussions are not limited to those aspects, and the principal interlocutor, in this case, mostly the prime ministers, or in some cases the presidents, are absolutely at, they can at their own will add or change items, or discuss about other issues which are not on the agenda. There's no stopping them from doing that. But a lot of the discussions are in a very structured way. And you are also, in many cases, when the joint communique has to be issued, even that is discussed in great detail, with every full stop and every comma being discussed even before the actual meeting takes place. And after the meeting takes place, some changes are made to those statements and joint communiques, and then those statements are issued based on what actually transpired in the meetings, what is the exact reproduction of all that has happened. So it's a readout of the event as it happened. So there are, of course, it's a mix and match, but you are very clear about what are the issues which are crucial to your interest, to your areas, and you want to listen to the other partner, bilateral country leader, as to what are his points which he wishes to make. So you first start off by discussing the political issues between the two countries, meaning not the politics part of it, but how the relationship is going. And then you move on to important issues of economy, the trade, then the military, and then you talk about the region, then you talk about geopolitics, then you talk about geostrategy, then you talk about the future, then you talk about inviting either leader to your country. So that is how it is mostly structured overall. So they go point by point through all these issues. And here we have, of course, globally also very important issues, as we had discussed earlier, the Ukraine-Russia war, the Israel-Iran war, the threat of Islamic Jihad to the world, the Chinese aggression and assertiveness, which is impacting a large number of countries, and the climate change and other issues, which are, of course, important to many countries, but may not be as important to some leaders, such as Donald Trump currently.
Yes, absolutely. Ambassador Kapoor, building on what you've just said there in terms of key topics, I do have an update to bring. A senior G7 official has said that the G7 leaders plan to issue a joint statement on Iran calling for de-escalation. That is an update that we have had. This message of de-escalation and calm and diplomacy is one that has been made by several of the leaders who will be attending, but now confirmation that the G7 leaders plan to issue a joint statement. Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, how easy will that be for that joint statement to be aligned with all of the leaders who are there? Of course, escalation and wider tensions is something that nobody wants, but there might be some people who are more in support of Israel and the situation in Iran than others, namely the United States, of course, key allies with Israel. Other world leaders potentially looking at ramifications on them and impacts on them as a priority as well. How simple is it for a joint statement to be written up with so many nations, not just the 7 nations, but other invitees as well?
There are 2 formats possible for this joint communique, joint statement. If they limit it to the G7 group of countries as a joint statement amongst the G7, and then it may make the task a little bit easier, because the divergences of opinion within the G7 on this issue may not be very significant, and they may be able to bridge that. Whereas if they bring in all the other countries, the leaders of which are going to be participating, which includes, countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Indonesia, and others, Korea, etc., then it becomes a little more difficult, because they would have their own viewpoints on the problem and their own inputs on the problem, and then it takes a little longer. India will, of course, play a very important role in any drafting, because normally if the Indian team is involved in any multilateral discussions and negotiations, on many occasions I've seen that the initial draft is put up by the Indian diplomats, and then the other countries get working on that draft, and that makes it move a little faster. But in this case, since India is not as yet officially a member of G7, it will have some role in terms of guiding the efforts and giving inputs for the draft. But I don't think it will be, either requested or it will be interested to write up the initial draft. But whatever the views are, since India is a neutral country currently, importantly aligned with Israel, because for Israel it's a threat of their existence primarily, and they are fighting a war where their existence is threatened. So India supports their existence, supports their continuation as a state, as a country, and any threats to its existence is not going to be accepted by India either. So the wordings accordingly will reflect the position of India in this sphere. Thank you, Joshua.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ambassador Kapoor. We do bring you some breaking news now, which relates to this key topic expected to be discussed at the G7, and that is, according to Turkey's President Erdogan and his office, Erdogan has told Trump that Turkey is ready to make every effort, including playing a facilitator role. He has urged Trump to take action immediately to prevent a disaster that could set the region on fire. Turkey's Erdogan has also welcomed US President Trump's latest statement on peace between Israel and Iran in a phone call. Ross, I will come to you on this matter. Of course, Trump in that Truth Social post earlier saying that he's looking to play a role in a peace deal like the India-Pakistan one that was made. Also saying that a deal can be done between Israel and Iran. Now Turkey also talking about playing a potential mediator role, as we have seen them do in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Could these two countries together, given their locality, given their political stance and allied nature, do you think these two nations could come together and make a real impact in the ongoing Iran-Israel tensions?
Very unlikely. Israel has very clear goals, which is to degrade or even eliminate Iran's nuclear capability. And until that mission is finished, Israel is not going to stop. And the other countries, whether it's Turkey or anyone else, there's really nothing they could say to change Prime Minister Netanyahu's mind about this topic. Netanyahu's been clear for years already that Israel would not tolerate Iran making progress towards nuclear weapons. And in his estimation, or in his judgment, the time came for military action, especially with Iran dragging its feet in the negotiations with the United States, even though the United States made a very generous offer to provide uranium enriched offshore for use in civilian nuclear power plants. Iran declined that deal, and Israel decided to take action. So it's really unlikely, I think, at this moment that any other countries could influence Netanyahu's decision-making. And it's certainly not going to be Turkey, which has been such a critic of Israel over the war in Gaza.
Ross, we do have some more breaking news on this topic to bring you and our audience. Just to update you, according to an exclusive Fox News interview, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has confirmed the presence of American troops in their latest clash with Iran. The Israeli Prime Minister has stated that American pilots are shooting down drones headed towards Israel. This could have major ramifications, as Iran had previously warned the US, UK and France that their bases and ships in the region will be targeted if they help stop Tehran's strikes on Israel. Ross, I come back to you. This huge news could have potential consequences. We've just said what Iran has threatened to do, but if this is the case, this is direct US involvement in these tensions between Iran and Israel, this war between Iran and Israel. That's the antithesis to what Turkey have said, what President Erdogan said there. This surely isn't a move towards peace. This is surely a move towards provocation, given what we've heard from the Iranians.
The United States is not going to see it as a provocation. The United States is going to see it as coming to the defense of its ally, Israel. And keep in mind that the previous time that Iran launched missiles or drones towards Israel, the United States and other countries also came to Israel's aid as well. So if it is true that United States resources, whether that's naval resources or Air Force resources, are being used to defend Israel, it comes as a surprise to no one. But President Trump has also made it very clear that if Iran attacks American interests or American resources in the region, America will respond. So I think the Iranian leadership's got to be very, very careful here.
Yes, what would a US response look like, Ross? We've seen removal of personnel from bases within the region already. That came before Israel's Friday action that we saw across Iran. Does this mean that there is a potential for US strikes on Iran, as Trump has threatened since the start of discussion over a potential US-Iranian nuclear deal if a deal couldn't be agreed? Iran say the talks are now off the table. So is this just the natural next step in that promise that Trump made?
If Iran was to send missiles or drones towards United States ships or bases in the Persian Gulf or Middle East, then the United States is going to attack from where those missiles and drones came from. They will attack the Iranian bases where those missiles and drones were launched. And we'll have a war between Israel and the United States on one side and Iran on the other. So that's why I said Iran has to think very, very carefully. Even if the United States is assisting Israel in taking out Iran's missiles and drones, I think Iran needs to be very careful about attacking any United States bases or ships in the region. That would be a very big mistake and a very risky action by Iran.
Yes, Ross, I do have some more breaking news. Building off that last update that we gave you in the same interview when asked about a Reuters report that Trump vetoed the Israeli plan to kill Iran's supreme leader, Netanyahu said that he is not going to get into that. Let me just repeat that there for you. In the same interview when asked about a Reuters report that Trump has vetoed an Israeli plan to kill Iran's supreme leader, Benjamin Netanyahu said that he is not going to get into that. Ross, we have a minute or so left. Does this show Israeli intentions? If this Reuters report is true, Benjamin Netanyahu avoiding answering that question. We understand from Marco Rubio that these attacks were happening anyway and the US weren't involved. We know that these attacks on Friday had been months in planning. Is this a clear agenda potentially from Israel on what they want out of this military action and what ultimately their goal is?
Well, we have to keep in mind that Iran has been the weapons provider and funder to a number of terrorist groups that have been attacking Israel. So it would make sense for Israel to attack the location and the leadership from where that terrorist funding and weapons come from. And Iran has funded the Houthis, it's funded and armed Hamas and Hezbollah and groups in Syria. So it would become as no surprise that Israel will consider the supreme leader as a target as well.
Ross, thank you ever so much for spending so long with us talking about all the geopolitical ramifications. Also, thank you to Ambassador Kapoor. Join us shortly where we'll continue to dissect this upcoming G7 summit in Alberta, Canada.
I'm Megha Sharma and I'm in these gorgeous locales of Cananices. Cananices is the location where the G7 Leaders Summit is taking place between June 15th and June 17th. The global heads of the biggest economies of the world are going to descend in this place, including the United States President Donald Trump, the French President Emmanuel Macron, and the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni.